Okay, well, thank you all for joining here today. I am someone who also can participate in the senior services, as I just had my 70th birthday. I'm a social worker, a licensed independent social worker, which means that I have my master's in social work from the University of Iowa, and am licensed at the highest level of social work. I'm a 1970 graduate of Winterset High School, so knowing what has happened in that community this weekend, I've contacted the Chamber of Commerce and the American Red Cross. I've done work for them, for the American Red Cross in the past, and so maybe leaving today to go to Winterset to see what I can do to help out in that community. But one of the things that I've been interested in, I spent 20 years in the Iowa House of Representatives and was minority leader in the Iowa House for 5.5 years. And one of the things that I have always been interested in is the incredible civil rights history that we've had here in Iowa. And so that's the reason for the presentation today. Well, to start out with this discussion of what is different here in the state of Iowa and was different with the history that we had here in our state, I wanted to first talk a little bit about the background that the first African-American slaves, this horrible history that we have in this country and other European-based countries have of enslaving our brothers and sisters from Africa, something that we struggled with throughout the history of our country. So the first African-American slave, or the first African slaves were brought to the Virginia colony in I see it says 1919. It should be 1818, 12 years after the settlement. Actually, it should be 1619, excuse me. 12 years after the settlement of the Jamestown colony that occurred in 1607. Africans were brought to America to help with tobacco production, but it was soon determined that they could be exploited for the production of other crops as well. And so we found that this was a economic benefit to enslave our brothers and sisters of African descent. So it's also important, I think, that we often forget that slavery was practiced throughout the colonies during the 17th and 18th centuries. And during the latter part of the 18th century, movements began in the North to discontinue slavery. And there were some reasons for that, that it wasn't all that we were interested in doing the right thing, but the economies were different in the North, and in the North, they relied less on the large farming operations, and they also were looking at what was occurring during the British rule. And I believe it was 1844 or around that time that in England they abolished slavery of all people. So slavery was never widespread in the North, and it was close to this. Actually, this point is a point that I wanted to research. I pulled this together several years ago, and I wanted to go back over my notes, and apology that I didn't. But the notation that slavery was close to extinction under the invention of the cotton gin, that this made the processing of cotton much less labor intensive as a result of that. And between 1774 and 1804, a number of the northern states banned slavery. So this was not a new concept here in Iowa. But it's also important to note that many of the northern investors had money invested in the slavery operations that were going on in the South. So while they weren't directly participating in this activity, they were funding and receiving the benefit from people being enslaved in the South. This is something that Catherine probably remembers, that we studied a great deal in the policy class that she took, that the U.S. Constitution counted slaves in the sentences as 3/5 of a person, so not as a full human being, and that over 5,000 African American soldiers and sailors fought in the Revolutionary War, fighting for, in many ways, promulgation of a system that excluded them and didn't fully count them and didn't express appreciation for what they did for this country to gain its independence. And at the height of slavery, 1/3 of the South's population were slaves. The importation of slaves was banned in 1808. Now, that doesn't mean that illegal slave trading and bringing in people primarily through Cuba didn't continue on beyond that date. But domestic trading of slaves continued on and actually became more profitable as a result of the ban on importation of slaves. I also think it's important to know that several famous Americans owned slaves, including George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. And Catherine, I think if you hit a time or two more, you'll get more information on this slide. This, I think, is one of the tragedies and one of the reasons why in the Democratic Party, looking at Jefferson as one of the founders of the political party, that there has been a de-emphasis on Thomas Jefferson. In his lifetime, he owned more than 200 slaves. And some of them, if you notate the relationship between him and Sally Henning, some of them were his own children. And there has been, since this has come out, more emphasis on the fact that the Jefferson family was a very large family, and they have had reunions since that time, recognizing their different heritages here. In his lifetime, he freed only 2 of the slaves, owning 200 slaves, freeing 2 of them. And if Catherine hits again, she'll see that he freed 5 upon his death. Now, the next thing that's very interesting in the way of background is the Missouri Compromise. This was passed in 1820, and it was a compromise between the pro-slavery and the anti-slavery factions in the United States Congress. And it was primarily, the interest was the regulation of slavery in the Western territories. It prohibited slavery in the former Louisiana Territory, which you may remember Iowa is part of, north of the parallel of 3630 north, except within the boundaries of the proposed state of Missouri. So Missouri, our state just to the south of us, became a state in 1820 with the Missouri Compromise, and slavery was allowed in the state of Missouri. So if you look at this map, you can see then that with slavery going to the Iowa border, and in a minute here we'll look at the Iowa Territory, but this brought slavery, the potential for slavery, to the highest point or the northernmost point in the United States. Now, the Iowa Territory was much larger than the state of Iowa. And it existed between 1838 and 1846, with the first capital being in the city of Burlington, and then later it was moved to Iowa City, and of course the territorial capital is now the administrative buildings building at the University of Iowa. So it brought slavery then to the Missouri or to the Iowa border. And then you can see that the Iowa Territory went all the way to the Canadian border. So we were a buffer then between what was occurring in Canada and what was occurring in the southern states. So the territory had 3 branches of government, just like a state and the federal government. So we had a legislative branch here, we had an executive branch, and we had some delegates that went to the U.S. Congress as well. So these are the cases then. That's the background of where we were at as a country, very much torn apart by this idea of enslaving our brothers and sisters of African descent. Among other things, we should have been happy that in Haiti they were establishing a republic, a sister republic next to the United States of America. But we didn't, and were silent about Haiti because it came out of a slave rebellion. And in the United States, they did not want slaves in rebelling. So the first case that distinguishes Iowa was the case in the matter of Ralph. And if any of you are trained in legal information and how cases are recorded, this case is 1 Iowa 1. So the very first case of the Territorial Supreme Court. So first of all, Ralph Montgomery, the last name taken from his owner, was an African-American slave living in Missouri. And unfortunately, we don't have any photographs of him. And at that time, lead was being mined in Iowa, in the area around Dubuque, Iowa. And stories circulated through the Midwest about people getting rich mining lead. So Ralph and his owner cooked up this deal that if Ralph came to Iowa, mined lead, and earned $550 plus interest to be given. He would then be given his freedom, and he would be emancipated by his owner. And I think, as any of us who would be in that situation, Ralph accepted the conditions and came to Iowa. And though he tried, he was unable to earn the $550 over 4 years. And so the owner, and I should say here, so-called owner, filed for Ralph to be extradited and returned to Missouri and his enslavement. So 2 slave catchers were offered to return Ralph to his so-called owner for $100. They captured and handcuffed Ralph in Burlington and prepared to send him back to Missouri on a Mississippi riverboat. A fellow named Alexander Butterworth was a concerned eyewitness and saw the capture of Ralph. And with the aid of Judge T.S. Wilson and a court order, he rescued Ralph from his captors just before they left to go back into Missouri. They filed in the Iowa territorial courts, and Ralph sought to remain in Iowa and to remain being free. And so in the very first ruling of the Iowa Territorial Supreme Court, the Supreme Court ruled, these are the words: people are not property, and therefore not subject to the rights of property. Ralph was a free man. The year was 1839. And this is very important, that we weren't even a state yet. The first ruling, it very much distinguished Iowa as being an anti-slavery state or anti-slavery territory at the time. Now, it's important, too, to keep in mind what was going on in the rest of the country. The struggle between the slaveholding states and the anti-slave states was continuing to go on. And in 1857, the U.S. Supreme Court decided the Dred Scott decision, which is considered by many to be one of the worst decisions that has been put out by the U.S. Supreme Court. And in that decision, they said that African Americans, free or a slave, have no rights of citizenship and could not sue in the federal courts. So they didn't have standing in order to even bring these cases back. Again, keep in mind the year is 1857. And we're talking about Iowa having made a ruling as a territory in 1839. There are some legal scholars who argue that that should have been the precedence for the decisions regarding enslaving people rather than the Dred Scott decision. But this set the stage for the platform of the newly formed Republican Party. Remember that John C. Fremont was the first Republican to run for president. He ran in 1856. And the second one was Abraham Lincoln, who ran and won the White House with the smallest popular vote of any president in American history, drawing 39% of the vote. And again, it's considered the worst decision of the Supreme Court. So what's also happening in Iowa during this time is President James K. Polk, the reason why we have Polk County in Iowa, signed the law granting statehood to Iowa, which was a portion of the original Iowa Territory. And so we became a state on December 26, 1846, and established our current constitution and form of government. And it's important to note that the Iowa Constitution is one of the least amended constitutions in the nation. Now, the second case that I think is extremely important and honorable about Iowa, first of all, let me say one more thing about Ralph, is that a few years ago, before his death, Chief Justice Mark Cady arranged for a stone to be placed at Ralph's grave in Dubuque. And so that's been fairly recent that the stone was added there. So then on to the second important case. Alexander Clark was a fellow that was born in Pennsylvania in 1826. His parents had fled to Pennsylvania to be free from slavery. And in 1842, he settled with his family in Muscatine County. At that time, Iowa had segregated schools. And Alexander Clark's daughter, Susan, attempted to secure admission to the school in proximity to the Clark home. Now, I wanted you to think about how incredibly humiliating this history that this child went through. First of all, she was denied admission based on the color of her skin. And this child, the other thing, the humiliation and the determination to receive an education is quite incredible. So first, she took her lessons out under a tree, listening to the teacher through the walls of the schoolhouse. Then she sat on the steps of the schoolhouse to take her lessons that way. Then she was allowed into the classroom and seated on the floor, which again, imagine the humiliation of all the other students around you being seated in the classroom. And then she was finally seated, given her own seat. And the white parents became angry that this child was participating in their school. Alexander Clark took the matter to the courts and went from the district courts to the Iowa Supreme Court. Some of us remember when Iowa started having a court of appeal, but in these days, there were two levels of courts, the district court and the Supreme Court. And in 1868, 86 years before the U.S. the U.S. Supreme Court ruled the same in Brown versus the Board of Education, the Iowa Supreme Court ruled that no child, again, this is the language, no child can be denied the right to a public education based on color, ethnicity, or the like. Now, something that I think all of us who've lost our parents and lost our grandparents, every so often we think that we should have asked them this or we should have asked them that. My mother kept tons of family pictures, and she has pictures of my grandmother's country school in Lucas County, Iowa. And in every one of the pictures, there's a young girl who appears to be African American. And a while back, I was talking with someone who was a professor of African American studies who said, very likely. And I asked for more clarification. And again, let's go back to Missouri, the Missouri Compromise, segregated schools in Missouri. And so she said many African Americans in Missouri sent their children over the line into Iowa, which would be possible in Lucas County, to receive an education in Iowa because our schools were desegregated. So we became a drawing point as a result of having this. My friend Rochelle Chase has written a couple of books about Buxton, Iowa, coal mining community in Monroe County that was completely integrated in the 1880s. And those books, by the way, are very much worth the read about how this community continued on and how there was mutual respect in the community. So here's some things that I think are important too. Alexander Clark, first of all, his son, Alexander Clark Jr., this would be Susan's brother, became the first African American to graduate from the University of Iowa's College of Law. His father, Alexander Clark Sr., became the second African American to graduate from the University of Iowa's College of Law, and that the writings of Alexander Clark Sr. were used by Martin Luther King in the civil rights movements of the 1950s and the 1960s. Alexander Clark Sr. was appointed minister, now we would say ambassador, but minister to Liberia by President Benjamin Harrison. And he died while providing services to his country as minister to Liberia. Cogger versus the Northwest Union Packet Company. So Emma Cogger was an Iowa school teacher who decided to travel across the Mississippi River by ferry from Keokuk to Quincy, Illinois. One of Emma Cogger's grandparents had been African American. The year was 1872. On the trip back to Iowa, she met up with some friends who said, "Hey, Emma, we're having lunch. Why don't you join us?" And so she went into the whites only dining car. Emma was forcibly removed from the dining car, and as the porters carried her out, she would grab the tablecloths off of the tables and dishes would come crashing to the floor, and she took the skin off the shins of the two porters who removed her. And she sued, and the matter eventually made its way to the Iowa Supreme Court. So in this time period, I think 1873, the Iowa Supreme Court affirmed equal protection under the law. And in its ruling, it cited both the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution and the Equal Protection Clause of the Iowa Constitution. Now, this is important because many legal scholars feel that the Iowa Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution is one of the strongest in the nation. And as a result of having a strong equal protection clause of the Iowa Constitution, Breed versus Varnum, or Varnum versus Breen, excuse me, the Supreme Court case that legalized same-sex marriage in Iowa was able to be accomplished because of the strong equal protection clause of the Iowa Constitution. So the result of this decision, the Cogger decision, from 1873 forward, no services in Iowa could legally discriminate on the basis of race. The U.S. Supreme Court did not rule the same until 91 years later. So there was a period of time in the United States where the legal standard was called separate but equal, put forth by the U.S. Supreme Court on accommodation. So if we had a equal kind of position for people of color versus the dominant culture, then that was considered acceptable. A curious kind of thing that at the time, one of the legal or lawyers for the NAACP, Thurgood Marshall, argued in Pennsylvania that and this is a term that was used at the time, Colored Teachers Association in Maryland could not discriminate, or that there was unequal treatment under that, and he won the case before the U.S. Supreme Court. So this is the motto here of the state of Iowa, and is what we believe about our liberties, that we prize them, and our rights we will maintain. I think that these are three cases that clearly support that this is what Iowa is all about and what we need to be protecting here in our lifetimes. So with that, you can see that I don't have any difficulty talking. And so I'll turn it back over to Catherine and see if we have questions that we can entertain.
I did want to start one question off with, you said the Iowa Constitution was the least amended constitution of each state?
Yeah. Well, I don't know if it's the least amended, but it is one of the least amended constitutions, which speaks to the quality of how it was written in the beginning.
So you would say it's more so based on how much of a head start that we had at the beginning, and less of how we slowed down and change
right
to the rest of the country. Okay.
Yeah, that the people who wrote the Iowa Constitution, and I think that it had some basis in Indiana and maybe another state, but showed that they had foresight for the future, and wrote things like a very strong equal protection clause to the Iowa Constitution.
So do you think this recent transgender denial of sports participation will, win on the basis of equal protection in Iowa?
Well, these are very different times, and every so often when I would bring up Iowa's history in the 1800s to my good friend, former Representative Wayne Ford, he would say, "Smith, that's the Iowa of the past, not the Iowa of the present." And I have a great deal of concern that we stay consistent with this history of Iowa in the past. And the case before the court on abortion or rights of women to be in charge of their bodies, I think are going to be the ones that tell us whether we are going to be true to our history or not. And I worry that we're not going to be true to our history.
Oh, we have something in the chat. I would be interested in your observations about what has happened to the Iowa values that supported past decisions.
Yeah, that's the concern that I have, that the erosion of a quality public school system here in Iowa, the kinds of things that my parents, grandparents did, the settlers of this state had barely broken sod before they started building schools. And the inclusion that occurred from 1860 on has occurred because we've had a strong public school system. I'm worried that that is very much, I think it's a fact that that's very much in jeopardy right now.
Well, Mark, I don't think there's going to be any other questions, but it was a very fascinating and awesome presentation. Oh, wait, we have a less hopeful ending here, but thanks very much for an informative presentation. Yes. That was from Bob. But thank you so much, Mark. I really appreciate your time. I think we all appreciated your time and all this information. It was very, very insightful.